They say every small town in America hides a secret. But Odd, West Virginia, is different. Here, nestled in the thick Appalachian woods, a family tree grew crooked, so twisted that generations of cousin marriages blurred the line between kinship and cruelty. Outsiders whispered about strange births, missing travelers, and houses where screams were swallowed by the forest. In the 1990s, authorities stumbled on a chilling truth buried beneath decades of silence. A family who lived far from society, where bloodlines folded in on themselves, and marriages were arranged not out of love, but out of control. Murders, hidden graves, and unimaginable taboos emerged, and investigators soon realized they were dealing with something darker than crime. They were staring into the abyss of what happens when a family becomes a kingdom, and outsiders are never meant to leave alive. Odd, West Virginia, may sound like just another forgotten town on the map. But once you hear what happened here, you'll never look at a quiet rural road the same way again. Odd, West Virginia, was more than just a name. It was a warning. With fewer than 800 people spread across its rural ridges and valleys, it was a town where strangers rarely stopped, and locals rarely left. Families had lived on the same land for generations, passing down not just farms, but bloodlines that tangled like vines. Rumors of cousin marriages and children born with strange features weren't just gossip. They were common knowledge, whispered over diner counters and church pews. Sheriff records from the late 1970s show a troubling pattern. Missing hunters, drifters, and even delivery drivers who vanished after their routes cut through the back roads. Most cases were quietly closed as lost in the woods. Yet locals told a different story. They warned of a particular family, reclusive, hostile, and bound together in ways that outsiders could never understand. No one dared to approach their land after dark. By the early 1990s, the whispers had grown louder. Teachers noticed children who came to school with unexplainable bruises, their eyes dull, their faces almost expressionless. Social workers filed reports, but visits to the family's property always ended in slammed doors and veiled threats. The town of Odd had secrets, and everyone knew where they started. But in a place where everyone's cousin is also their neighbor, silence was safer than truth. Until one night, when a man stumbled out of the woods bloodied and broken, claiming he had been held captive by the very family no one dared to name. The man who stumbled into town one cold autumn night was nearly unrecognizable. His clothes were shredded, his face battered, and his voice cracked from screaming. Locals said he looked like he hadn't eaten in days. His name was William Carter, a delivery driver from Beckley, and he had been missing for nearly 2 weeks. The sheriff's office had already written him off as another lost hiker in the Appalachian backwoods. But William's story forced them to reopen old files. Between gulps of water, William explained he had been delivering supplies when his truck broke down near an unmarked dirt road. He remembered walking toward a flicker of light, what he thought was a farmhouse where he could ask for help. Instead, he said, "They grabbed me before I could even knock." For days, he was kept in a dark cellar where he heard whispers upstairs, voices calling each other brother, sister, and even husband and wife interchangeably. The smell was unbearable, a mix of rot and damp earth. When he tried to escape, a tall man with strangely sloped shoulders beat him with a shovel. William claimed he wasn't the only one down there. He heard muffled cries, scratching on the walls, and once, a weak voice that begged him not to scream because they like it when you scream. His chance came when the cellar door was left unlatched during an argument upstairs. He crawled through mud, broken glass, and barbed wire before finding his way to the road. The sheriff listened, pale as a ghost, because William's description matched the same reclusive family that had been whispered about for decades. What terrified him most wasn't William's injuries. It was that the man claimed there were still others trapped in that house. The family at the heart of William's story lived on the edge of town, on land so overgrown with vines and brush that the dirt road leading to it was almost invisible. Locals called them the Hensley clan, a name spoken in whispers, usually followed by nervous glances over the shoulder. Their property stretched across several acres of swampy woods, dotted with collapsing barns, rusted-out cars, and a main house that leaned so heavily it looked ready to sink into the earth. No one remembered the last time any of them had been seen in church, at a store, or even in town. They lived apart, and most said it was better that way. But investigators soon learned why. The Hensleys had been marrying cousins for generations, their family tree more like a knot than a branch. Birth records were scattered, often altered, and many children were never even registered. Those who were seen in public often appeared different. Slanted eyes that didn't quite match, lips twisted unnaturally, hands with missing or extra fingers. Teachers recalled siblings who barely spoke, who sat in class rocking back and forth until they were pulled out of school entirely. It wasn't just appearance that set them apart. Rumors spread of screams echoing from the woods at night, of hunters spotting bonfires surrounded by strange figures. Some swore they saw children tied to posts. Others claimed the Hensleys buried their dead in shallow pits behind the house. Dogs refused to go near their property, and more than one deputy admitted that whenever they tried to serve notices, the family would line up silently on the porch, men, women, children, just standing there, staring, as if daring anyone to come closer. Police reports hinted at domestic violence, missing livestock, even suspected homicides. But every time an investigation started, it stalled. Witnesses grew silent. Deputies looked the other way, and the Hensleys slipped back into the shadows of odd. Until William's testimony forced the sheriff's hand. For the first time in decades, law enforcement had no choice but to confront the family head-on. What they were about to uncover would be worse than anyone imagined. Armed with William's testimony, Sheriff Dalton organized a small team of deputies to investigate the Hensley property. But even before they set foot on the land, an unnatural silence seemed to swallow the woods. No birds, no crickets, just the crunch of leaves beneath their boots. The deputies later said it felt like walking into a place where time had stopped, where the earth itself didn't want them there. The main house loomed at the end of the dirt path, its windows covered with thick curtains, the porch sagging under years of rot. The smell of decay hit them immediately, an odor so thick it clung to their uniforms. As they circled the property, they discovered makeshift cages made from rusted fencing, their bars bent inward, as though someone had clawed at them desperately. A nearby shed was padlocked from the outside, and the ground around it was littered with bones. Not all of them animal. Inside the house, the deputies found rooms frozen in filth. Mattresses soaked with stains, dishes piled with mold, and walls covered in hand-drawn markings. Crude drawings of stick figures holding hands, some crossed out with black X's. The cellar was exactly as William described. Chains bolted to the walls, scraps of clothing on the floor, and a stench so powerful that deputies gagged as they stepped inside. One officer swore he heard faint breathing in the dark, but when they shined their flashlights, nothing moved. But the most disturbing discovery wasn't in the cellar. It was upstairs, in a locked bedroom. The door had been nailed shut from the outside, and when they pried it open, they found a girl, pale, emaciated, and unable to speak. Her eyes darted wildly, as though she couldn't comprehend who these uniformed men were. Scars lined her wrists and ankles, and her hair was matted as if she hadn't seen sunlight in years. The deputies carried her out, but as they did, they realized something terrifying. Every door they had opened so far creaked loud enough to echo through the woods. If the Hensleys were watching, and in a town like Odd, they always were, then the deputies weren't rescuers. They were intruders, and the family would be coming. As the deputies rushed the frail girl back toward their vehicles, the woods around them seemed to come alive. Branches cracked, footsteps shuffled in the underbrush, and low murmurs drifted through the trees. By the time they reached the edge of the property, flashlights caught the reflection of dozens of eyes watching from the dark. The Hensleys weren't scattered, as many believed. They were gathered, surrounding the intruders like hunters circling prey. Sheriff Dalton ordered his men to hold their ground, but the family didn't advance. Instead, they stood in eerie silence. Men with twisted faces and crooked jaws, women with sunken cheeks and hollow stares, children barefoot and glassy-eyed. Some held farming tools, others carried nothing at all. It was the stillness that unnerved the deputies most, as if this silent army was waiting for something. Then, one of the older men stepped forward, his features distorted, but his voice coldly clear. She was promised. The deputies realized the girl they had rescued wasn't just a prisoner. She was a bride. The family's twisted traditions demanded marriages between cousins, siblings, and sometimes even parents and children. The girl had been chosen, groomed, and locked away until her wedding. William's captivity hadn't been random either. He had stumbled too close and seen too much. And then came the most horrifying detail. In the cellar, deputies noticed something they hadn't at first: a row of shallow graves covered with loose boards. When they pulled one back, they saw bones. Not animal bones, but human remains. Some fresh, some long decayed. The Hensleys hadn't just hidden their sick traditions. They had silenced anyone who threatened to expose them. The deputies called for backup, but radios hissed with static. The road back to town was long, winding, and now blocked by shadows moving between the trees. Sheriff Dalton whispered what everyone was thinking. "We're not getting out of here clean." The deputies formed a tight circle around the girl, flashlights flickering as the forest seemed to close in. The family moved slowly, deliberately, their feet crunching over the leaves without a word. Sheriff Dalton raised his shotgun, shouting warnings, but the Hensleys didn't flinch. Instead, one of the younger boys, his face misshapen, his eyes too far apart, lurched forward with a rusted pitchfork. The deputies fired a warning shot into the air, and the boy retreated. But the rest of the clan stood firm, their pale faces glowing faintly in the moonlight. The rescuers had no choice but to push forward. They dragged the girl toward their patrol car, stumbling through the dark path. Then, from the shadows, a woman screamed, a high, piercing wail that echoed across the valley. In an instant, the silence shattered. Dozens of figures burst from the trees, rushing with terrifying speed. The deputies fired, gunshots lighting up the night, but for every body that fell, more came crawling out of the dark. One deputy was dragged down, vanishing beneath clawing hands and snarling voices. Another's flashlight was knocked aside, rolling on the ground and illuminating a scene of pure chaos. Faces twisted in rage, mouths foaming, eyes gleaming with something feral. Sheriff Dalton fired his last shell, screaming for his men to get her to the car. William, still weak but desperate to survive, grabbed the girl's arm and sprinted with her toward the road. The deputies followed, covering their retreat, until finally the car headlights came into view. But as they piled inside, another horror unfolded. The tires had been slashed, the windshield shattered. The Hensleys had planned for this. With no vehicle and the family closing in, the rescuers were forced to flee on foot, crashing through the woods with the girl clinging to William. Behind them, the screams grew louder, closer. The night belonged to the Hensleys, and Odd, West Virginia, was their hunting ground. The night in Odd ended in blood and silence. Sheriff Dalton and his deputies fought through the woods, but by dawn, only a few emerged alive. William, the rescued girl, and two battered officers who stumbled onto the highway, flagging down a passing trucker. Their clothes were torn, their eyes wide with shock, and behind them, smoke rose from the trees, as if the Hensleys had tried to burn away the evidence. When state police and FBI teams returned hours later, the Hensley property stood eerily quiet. The cages, the cellar, the shallow graves, everything William had described was still there. But the family was gone. Beds were still warm, half-eaten meals sat on tables, and footprints led deep into the woods before vanishing altogether. It was as though the entire clan had melted into the Appalachian wilderness. The rescued girl was taken into state custody. She never spoke, not even to doctors or investigators. Some said her silence was fear. Others believed it was something far darker, that she had been born into their traditions and no longer knew how to exist outside of them. Sheriff Dalton resigned months later, his hair turning gray almost overnight. He refused to talk about what happened, only saying, "You can't fight what's bred into the bones." Today, Odd, West Virginia still exists, though its population has dwindled. Hunters still vanish in those woods. Travelers still whisper about strange figures watching from the trees. And every so often, a scream echoes through the hollows with no explanation. The Hensleys were never captured. No records exist of where they went. But in a town where cousin marriages twisted family into something monstrous, and where graves hid beneath rotting floorboards, one truth remains. Odd doesn't just describe the place. It describes the people who never left. And if you ever find yourself driving the back roads of West Virginia, and you see a crooked house with curtains drawn tight, don't knock. Don't even slow down. Because in Odd, the family might still be waiting,